Hey everybody, welcome on. We're super excited to have our inaugural Talk About Doubts panel going. Today we got a few experts covering a few different areas. This is going to be recorded and published to YouTube later, so if you don't want your face online, feel free to turn off your webcam, but if you're comfortable with it, you can keep it on. We are hoping that this will be largely driven by your guys' questions, whether that means you're dropping them in the chat, or you can always raise your hand and then we can have you throw on your microphone and your camera or just one of them and ask your question personally. If you have a question, feel free to just message me privately, just so that I can keep a list going so that I don't lose sight of you on the side. You can submit your questions on the chat here in Zoom, or you can submit them on the Discord channel as well. I'm on the teaching course Discord channel, so feel free to drop your question wherever it's most convenient. Now we're going to start and just let each of our experts introduce themselves. We'll start off with Jonathan McLatchie.
Great. So I'm an assistant professor in Sattler College in Boston, Massachusetts. I teach biology. So this semester I'm teaching a freshman biology course, teaching bioethics, microbiology, and anatomy and physiology. And I'm also a fellow of the Discovery Institute, and I'm very interested in scientific evidence that points to design in nature. I'm also very interested in the reliability of the Bible, particularly the New Testament, and the case for the resurrection of Jesus. You can find my personal website at jonathanmcclatchy.com, which archives a lot of my articles, videos, and so forth. And I also founded this talkaboutdoubts.com ministry as well. So that's a little bit about my background.
Perfect. And then next up, we'll have Max introduce himself.
Thanks, Justin. So I'm a lecturer in philosophy at Wycliffe Hall, Oxford University. I did my PhD in philosophy at Oxford, finished that about 6 years ago, and have also had a role at University of Notre Dame in the Centre for Philosophy of Religion there before I came back to Oxford about 6 years ago. And yeah, so my main research interests are in analytic philosophy of religion and epistemology. And those are the topics that I have published on. But I'm also very interested in the historical reliability of the New Testament.
Very cool. Thank you, Max. And then someone you guys probably have not heard of making his apologetics debut today, Dr. Timothy Mcgrew. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I feel a little embarrassed to come after Max because I have to say some of the same things. I'm a professor of philosophy at Western Michigan, where I have been teaching for just over 27 years now. And so that's a good thing when you find a job that you love that much and they don't hate you, so you can keep it. And I'm kind of miffed at Max for having been apparently down at Notre Dame and never made the pilgrimage just a little over an hour north to see me. This is frustrating. Come on, Max. So I right. Yeah, I'm going to hold you to that. I specialize in epistemology and in particular applications of probability theory and fundamental epistemology, internalism, foundationalism, issues surrounding those positions. And I have a very strong interest in the history and philosophy of science and have done some work there, and a very strong and long-standing interest in the general field of Christian apologetics, and more specifically in the applications of epistemological tools to New Testament studies, which I think is something that we desperately need, because a lot of times I look at the things that are being said by people who don't have those tools, and I really wish I could sort of put something into the water that would make them a little bit more epistemically astute, but also just answering people's questions, which is what we're all interested in here. And so I spend a lot of time in coffee shops as well as online, sitting down with people, listening to what they have to say and trying to engage with them, encourage them, help them, pray with them, work through their struggles. So I spend a lot of time doing that. I also share a strong interest with Jonathan, and I don't know if Max is into this, but Jonathan and I are both tournament chess players, and this is something that we really get into.
I just want to share that at a Talk About Doubts get together a couple months ago, I did have Tim Mcgrew beat me in chess while he was facing away from the board. So that was super fun and encouraging and disheartening. So well, just a reminder to everyone that we're going to be collecting questions a few different ways, and we hope that this will be largely audience driven, but we do have a few different categories of preset questions that'll kind of just get us going. And the first thing we want to start with is kind of just the general scientific realm. And the first question is going to be, what reasons do we have to believe in an intelligent creator? Jonathan, you want to kick us off, and then Max and Tim, if you guys want to chime in after that.
Sure. So there are a number of reasons to believe in an intelligent creator, both from the life sciences as well as physical sciences. I'll focus primarily on my own area of expertise, which is in the life sciences, where we've discovered over the last several decades that biology is chock full of digitally encoded information content in the form of the hereditary molecules that we call DNA and RNA. And information content in every realm of experience, whether we're talking about hieroglyphic inscription or digital programming script or what have you, is habitually associated with conscious, deliberative agency. And so when we find information content intrinsic to the hereditary molecules of DNA and RNA, I would argue that the most plausible explanation is that it too arose by virtue of an intelligent cause. Essentially, the way that I would conceive of evidence as a good Bayesian would be in terms of a likelihood ratio. Think about a ratio of the probability of the evidence existing, given that the hypothesis is true, versus the probability of that same evidence existing, given that the hypothesis is false. And to the extent to which that likelihood ratio is top heavy, that's the extent to which you have evidence for your hypothesis. So when it comes to intelligent design, the information content of the cell, I would argue, is far less surprising on the supposition that a mind was involved than it would be on the falsity of that assumption. And therefore you have a top-heavy likelihood ratio that tends to confirm the hypothesis of design. There are also molecular machines that we've discovered in the cell, thousands of them, which are which bear the property of being irreducibly complex. That is to say that you have a higher level objective that's accomplished by multiple well-matched interacting subcomponents that have to work together in unison to achieve some higher level objective. And intelligent agents uniquely are endowed with the capacity to visualize complex endpoints and bring everything together that's needed to realize that end goal, whereas stochastic unguided processes typically are not able to do that. So an irreducible complex system is essentially a system where you remove one of these interacting components and the system effectively ceases to function. And so how do you, by an unguided mindless process without knowing what the target is, put together one such system? There's also the genetic code that we discovered the genetic code is basically this language convention whereby codons are translated into amino acids. Codons are basically three-letter words in the language of DNA. And whenever we discover language conventions, these too arise by virtue of an intelligent cause. And the language convention that we call a genetic code is actually finely tuned for minimization of errors that might be incorporated as a result of mutation. And there's a number of levels of fine-tuning of the genetic code. And it turns out it's very difficult to get to a substantially evolving genetic code because modifying that mapping of codons to amino acids would require modifying every polypeptide chain produced by the cell, which would wreak havoc. So that's why Francis Crick described the genetic code as a frozen accident, and it's very, very difficult to evolve it by natural selection or some such mechanism. Lastly, very finally, I'll mention one other thing, which is one of the arguments that Michael Denton has put forward. He has a whole series of books, which are really, really excellent, highly commend to your reading, on the environmental fitness of nature for human existence. And one of the examples that he talks about in his book, The Miracle of the Cell, is the fitness of chemistry for allowing for complex life forms such as ourselves. So the non-metal atoms, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, are the main elements that comprise the substances of the cell. And these are really the only atoms that you could use to build a biochemical system. And the reason for that is because they make strong, stable directional chemical bonds. And critically, these covalent bonds give molecules with shape. All right, and it's shape that's the essence of biochemistry. And these atoms also have an electronegativity such that the attraction of electrons for hydrogen and carbon is very similar. So this means that you basically generate, by putting carbon and hydrogen together, what are called non-polar molecules, where you have this equal distribution of electrons between that are shared in that covalent bond. And but if you put oxygen and hydrogen together, you get what's called a polar molecule, where you have an uneven distribution. And so this actually gives rise to what's called the hydrophobic force, which is an important force that is so the hydrophobic force is the energetically dominant force for containment, adhesion, etc., in all life processes. And that means that you can actually fold proteins into their respective conformations. So basically the take-home point is that the very atoms that give you stable defined shapes from which you can build macromolecules also give you the hydrophobic force, which is the key to assembling them into higher three-dimensional forms. And that's an astonishing coincidence. And there's tons of things like that as well. So cumulatively, I'm very persuaded of the reality of design from this interdisciplinary case from the natural sciences.
Yeah.
Tim, anything you guys want to throw on?
Yeah, I don't think I have loads to add to that. I think that was very comprehensive from Jonathan. I mean, the one thing, probably to add is that a very popular design argument these days is the argument from cosmic fine-tuning. Now, obviously, our esteemed friend Tim has views on that argument, but the argument roughly goes that physics in the last few decades has discovered that there are various structural features of the physical cosmos that are extremely sensitive, such that an alteration in there, the values of various constants of physics, for example, would have yielded a universe that couldn't have contained or supported life. So, one example that's often given is the gravitational constant. So if that were, it's been estimated that if that were different by as little as 1 part in 10 to the 60, then you couldn't have a universe capable of supporting life. And the idea is that you don't just have one of these sort of fine-tuned parameters. You have, maybe a couple of dozen. And when you start to think about the probability that all of these parameters would have values that fall within the life permitting range, conditional on naturalism, it seems that the probability is extremely low, whereas the probability of the fine-tuning of the universe having fine-tuned values conditional on theism is vastly higher. So I should hand over to Tim, I think, to say a bit about why he has some concerns about that argument.
I'm actually not sure that that's the most interesting thing for folks here. So if you want to see what Lydia and I have said about that, there's a literature trail out there and you can find that. I'm as sensible as anyone of the intuitive attractiveness of these effects. I just haven't found a way to formulate it that seems to me rigorous yet. I'd like to pick up on just a couple of things from Jonathan's initial summary of these things. First of all, some of you may be familiar with Steve Meyer's work, and Steve's got a fairly recent book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. And one of the things that I love about that book is that for the first time, Meyer is working overtly, explicitly, with a comparison of probabilities of the kind that Jonathan outlined. He's doing a comparison of your expectations, supposing that theism is false, with your expectation for the same pieces of evidence, supposing that theism were true. And I think that's exactly the right way to proceed. Full disclosure, I interacted with Steve as he was working on that, but you might worry that the probabilities involved would just be inscrutable, that you wouldn't know how to get a grip on them. But I think that we can see from analogies that there are cases in ordinary life where you don't have to be a molecular biologist to see it, where we do pick up on significant mismatches between those. So an example I gave to Steve, and he put it into the book, so I'm happy about that, is that if I'm wandering in deep woods, miles and miles away from the roads, and I come over the lip of a little rise and I see a cabin that looks like it's kind of tumbled down, but I didn't expect to see anything there. I may initially think, wow, there's no pathway, there's no drive here. This must just be abandoned. And I strongly suspect that it's empty. But I go down and I push on a door and it opens. And there in a little table in the middle of the only room in the cabin, I see a cup. And in that cup, there's a bag, an Earl Grey tea bag. And the water is hot and it's obviously in the process of steeping. Now, I may not have any particular knowledge of who might inhabit it, and I certainly had no expectation that I was going to find a cup of Earl Grey tea steeping on the table. But whatever probability I give that there would be an inhabitant who would like tea, be it as low as you like, it's got to be many orders of magnitude higher than the probability that there'd be a cup of Earl Grey tea steeping still hot on the table if the cabin is uninhabited. I may not be able to tell you what the numbers are, but I know there's a vast mismatch between them. And so I know this is profound evidence in favor of that. And I think a lot of the things Jonathan was citing, even to the extent that I am able to get a grip on them and comprehend them, things like the specificity of the genetic code for robustness against error problems, and also just basic issues which fold in some of those things, like the origin of life at all, are really things that are like the cup of tea. They're clues that are hard to ignore. And it's not so important as you might have thought that you be able to say, oh, I can put an exact number on this one. What you can put your finger on is the vastness of the mismatch between the expectation, if there is an intelligent designing mind behind this, and the expectation if there's not. And I also like a line from John Lennox that science closes some gaps, but it opens others. And I think that the longer and harder we work on this, the more that we try to dig into these problems, the greater the mismatch appears. It's not like it's shrinking gradually and some naturalist might hope that eventually it'll shrink altogether. It's actually getting worse. So I think that that's sort of where I would go on the life sciences side of things. And let me just absolutely echo Jonathan's recommendation of the Michael Denton books. They're fabulous. I am blown away by the one on water, not making this up. He's got just a little book in this series on water. And I was not prepared for the ramified nature of the argument about just that one little molecule. It's astonishing. I won't even try to summarize it. Just go get the book.
I think that's a fantastic kind of canvas of this realm of intelligent design and fine tuning. I think the other area we see this come up a lot, specifically with the Christian worldview, is trying to bring modern science into the Genesis account. And this stark issue a lot of people take with sort of letting any modern science near that. But I know you guys have some different thoughts on that. I'd love to hear just what you guys think about how modern science works with the Genesis account. And I know that's a really loaded question, but maybe just a brief overview on, should Christians be worried about a pretty strong conflict there? Where does the misunderstanding lie with this issue?
I'm going to jump in because I wanted to be an astrophysicist at one point in my life. And I really have enjoyed doing my best to keep up with things on the cosmology front. I am profoundly persuaded that the universe is extremely old. And I'm persuaded that the Earth is extremely old. I was raised with what would be called a young Earth creation, flood geology context. That was the surrounding context in which I grew up. And many of those people are fine people. I have nothing to say against them. They're earnest. They're the kind of people that you would want to, be with you in hardship and in tragedy. But I think that they are just wrong on this issue. And so I don't have a beef with modern cosmology, modern geology. What that means is that we need to be able to look at Genesis and say, okay, can this reasonably be read in a manner that does not commit us to something like a very young universe, very young Earth? And I think that there are options there. And I don't think that they actually put a great deal of strain on that. But I see Ken is turned on his image. Ken is hearing what I'm saying. I hope that he's on board with this. Ken is an actual geologist. I don't even play one on TV. So yeah, this is. But it's a source of frustration to me, as I think it is to many people, that so many people who ought to be allies just can't get on board with this. I understand it. I don't want to accuse them in general of being in bad faith, but I really wish that we could sort of get on the same page with this. Anyway, that's Ken, maybe I should let you say something here.
Well, I can affirm, in fact, the evidence from geochemistry and from the nature of the Earth is absolutely overwhelming that the Earth is ancient. And the book that I direct people to actually is not primarily a geology book, but I direct them to start with Michael Strauss's The Creator Revealed, because he is a physicist at University of Oklahoma, and he works with the CERN group over in Switzerland that are looking at the origins of the Big Bang cosmology. And I just reread the book because I'm going to recommend it to the Colson Fellows program. And he says, God is telling us that his character is seen by what he has created. And Michael is able to weave that story so well that, in fact, the evidence right there from the Big Bang cosmology directly points to Genesis 1:1. Another factor about Genesis is I've just appreciated something that I've read from John Lennox, whose name was mentioned. I know of churches in the United States where young people are told either believe the earth is 6,000 years old or they're not a Christian. Many of them are lost to science because of that, and many of them lose their Christian faith. I've met so many people like that, and this question needs to be taken very seriously. So he is calling us to get after it and basically do that work. To apply just a few comments about the fine-tuning elements from geology and geochemistry. In a talk that I give, that God's glory in creation, I focus strictly on geology. And one of the factors is the earth has a magnetic field, because when God designed the earth and our planet, of these rocky planets that are in the habitable zone of having liquid water, a certain distance from the sun, there is just the right amount of uranium-238, thorium-232, and potassium-40 as the long half-life radioactive isotopes to have the interior of the earth with a molten core, which gives the earth a magnetic field that is long-term, over millions of years, billions of years, and stable, a stable magnetic field, which is the safeguard against solar radiation and cosmic radiation from continuously bombarding the earth and killing anything that would try to live here. So there's a whole series of things like that. The talk that I give focuses in on that fact. It focuses on the nature of water, and then it focuses on the atmosphere. Our atmosphere is unbelievably unique because just the right amount of oxygen is here, about 21%. If it were too much, we'd have fires all over the place. And if it were too little, we couldn't live. And then nitrogen is incredibly unique to be a companion to that it is neutral. It doesn't interact with things in our bodies. So it's basically just a perfect balance of the amount of oxygen and this unique composition of nitrogen in the atmosphere that makes it possible for respiration of the whole biosphere. Enough said now.
Just to add a few comments, you mentioned the fine-tuning to deflect or absorb solar rays from the sun. Another remarkable instance of fine-tuning that Michael Denton adduces in his book Children of Light is that there's a very, very narrow band of the electromagnetic spectrum that's conducive to photochemistry and photosynthesis, which is a form of photochemistry. And I mean, it's so narrow that it's equivalent to perhaps a few playing cards and a deck of cards stretching all the way to the Andromeda Galaxy. And that's how narrow that band is. And then there's the adjacent near-infrared band, which of course, which is felt as heat. Now, just by coincidence, it so happens that more than half of the radiation emitted by the sun falls in that very, very narrow range. And then the atmosphere also allows to penetrate radiation that falls within that very narrow band. And so that also, I think, points to design. Now, in terms of Genesis 1, the view that I would take is, so first of all, I think that the first day of creation week actually begins not in verse 1 of Genesis 1, rather in verse 3 of Genesis 1. It's the first occurrence of the phrase, and God said, which designates each of the beginning of each of the days of creation week. So by the time you even get to the first day of creation week, you already have the heavens and the earth in existence. Now, in terms of what I make of the days of creation week, the view that I would subscribe to is that of C. John Collins, who's a biblical scholar, is a specialist in biblical Hebrew. He's written a number of commentaries. He's written a commentary on Genesis 1 through 4, and he wrote a book called Reading Genesis Well, as well as a book called Science and Faith, Friends or Foes. And he basically articulates what he calls the analogical days view of Genesis 1, which is to say that the days of Genesis 1 are not identical to our solar days. Rather, they're analogous to the human rhythm of work and rest. That is to say that just as man has his 6 days that he labors and he rests on the Sabbath, so likewise God has his 6 days that he labors and he rests on the Sabbath. And that interpretation allows one to make sense of Exodus 20:11, for example, where the 6-day work week and the Sabbath day of rest is grounded upon the creation account in Genesis 1. So that's the view that I would take in a nutshell. Of course, there's a lot more to say there, but that would be my essential view.
Yeah, I'll just add one or two very quick points. I mean, one is, I think sometimes, naturalists will accuse Christians of backing off from a sort of position that Christianity held for hundreds of years, which is basically a young earth view, and have only backed off of that view in light of modern cosmology, geology, biology, and so on. But just very quick point to say that actually that's clearly false. And a good example of the falsity of that view is that St. Augustine held the view that the Genesis account was sort of allegorical or in some way not fully literal. Now, it's not that Augustine thought that the universe was ancient, as I think those of us on the panel would hold to. He actually thought the universe was created instantaneously. But either way, the point is that there's plenty of evidence that significant figures in the Christian tradition held a non-kind of literal view of the Genesis creation account well before modern science came along. So I don't think there's no good case for thinking there's just been a sort of ad hoc revision of Christian doctrines of creation in light of modern science. And actually, it's interesting when you look at the history of the emergence of the Big Bang theory. Some of the strongest opponents of the Big Bang theory were naturalist atheists. So Fred Hoyle defended the steady state theory of the universe. And Hoyle thought that the universe was past eternal, that it had existed forever. And I think it was Hoyle actually who coined the term Big Bang as basically a pejorative sort of label and basically an insult to the Big Bang inflationary model. And he said that, one of his fears was that if the Big Bang model came to be embraced, then it would give too much encouragement to theists because it looked a bit too similar to the biblical creation account.
If we're going to have to listen to people accusing the Christians of hypocrisy because their scientific views have been refined over time, I wonder what we're going to say about naturalists. All scientific views have been revised. If you take a large enough time slice, you'll see, from Lucretius, the Roman atomist, the idea of an eternal universe, and Hoyle stands in that tradition. And now we love us some Big Bang cosmology. So, yeah.
It's all about that ancient flat Earth, baby. I'm just kidding. I want to move us out of the natural sciences a little bit and get into some philosophical and more epistemological questions. So the first thing I want to talk about, just with what we do here at Talk About Doubts, with helping people question worldviews well, I would love to kind of cover some key epistemological principles that you guys have really cemented into how you think about worldviews, what you would recommend for other people questioning their worldview.
Well, okay, I'll just, sorry, did you want to go, Tim?
No, I just wondered whether Justin was going to pick on somebody or leave us to our own devices.
Sorry, I'll pick someone from now on.
Max, you're it.
Well, yeah, I mean, Tim and Jonathan have both implied this epistemological principle already. But I think the idea that you set some hypotheses down on the table side by side and you make comparisons in terms of how likely they make a given data point, and to the extent that that data point is more likely given one hypothesis than given the other, that data point confirms or supports that hypothesis over the other one. So that's one thing. And another thing, and actually Tim, and I think you wrote this paper with John DePoe, Tim, is this right? Yeah, there's a really good paper on cumulative case arguments, which, so basically, with that basic principle, the ratio of likelihoods, the idea that to the extent that a data point is more strongly predicted or made likely by one hypothesis than another, that's known as the ratio of likelihoods. When you get multiple independent pieces of evidence or data points, you actually, and you start to aggregate them, you multiply those ratios together and you can get something extremely powerful. And I think people often don't quite appreciate this. And it's, and there's an annoying kind of caricature of cumulative case arguments that sort of, I actually did a debate with an atheist a couple of months ago where he said, oh, putting 10 leaky buckets together doesn't make a good bucket. But that is you can actually show that is not, well, I mean, the leaky bucket thing is obviously pejorative, but the idea that just because one argument by itself isn't decisive, that therefore no matter how many of them you put together, you still don't get anywhere. That is demonstrably wrong, actually, and you can show it to be wrong with the odds form of Bayes' theorem. So yeah, and basically the point is that you can combine lots of pieces of evidence that are individually quite weak, actually, but once you start multiplying together their Bayes factors or their likelihood ratios, you can end up with something that's overwhelmingly powerful cumulatively.
Right, and this relates to a very common mistake that both atheists and theists make in the presentation or in their critique of theistic arguments. And that is that a lot of our critics will look at one argument, say the cosmological argument, for example, find it to be inconclusive in establishing the existence of God, and then move on to the next argument, say the fine-tuning argument, find it to be inconclusive, and then move on to the next argument, and so forth, without pausing to consider whether even if all of the arguments taken individually are not sufficient to justify the conclusion, they could well be, in aggregate, sufficient to justify the conclusion. So that's an important nuance that's important that we ought to bear in mind as we evaluate these things. And another piece of advice from an epistemological perspective that I would give is to be very wary of the fallacy of objections, which Tim has talked a lot about as well. It's basically a phrase that was coined by Richard Whately in his book, Elements of Logic, which is basically a common tendency I see among people that are struggling with doubts or are questioning the Christian faith, is that people will often become so fixated upon the objections and questions to which they don't currently have a satisfactory answer, that they miss sight of the pillar of positive confirmatory evidence for the faith. And it's important to look at all the evidence, let all the evidence speak. I mean, all complex hypotheses, whether we're talking about Christianity or evolution or climate change or whatever it happens to be, will have evidence both for and against the proposition in question. And what we have to try to elucidate is, where does the balance of evidence rest? And in our judgment, the balance of evidence rests in favor of Christianity. The question is not, are there objections to which we don't have satisfactory answers, but rather, are there more numerous and more substantive objections to believing the gospel to be true or to not believing it to be true. The other final point I'll make is that a very common cognitive bias that I often observe in people that are struggling with doubts through calls I've done to talk about doubts and elsewhere is what one might call the disconfirmation bias. All right, we're all familiar with the confirmation bias, where you tend to look at the evidence that supports your the view that you want to come to, and then ignore all the counter evidence. And we have to be wary of that for sure. But there's also a danger of following in the other direction, which is to say that one becomes so concerned and anxious about the role that one's confirmation bias might play in coloring their judgment about the evidence, that they are more trusting of sources that disconfirm their beliefs than those which confirm them, and are more likely or more prone to listen to and take seriously arguments against their beliefs than those that argue in favor of it. So I think we have to be careful of both confirmation and disconfirmation bias. Tim, do you have anything to add?
Just that we can even see this outside of the area of religious belief. So one of the ancient Roman sources on the Second Punic War says that when the citizens of Rome heard a rumor that their own forces had won a great victory and were on their way to Rome, they dared not lightly believe what they so greatly wished to be true. So this, I'm not going to allow myself to believe it because it would be such good news, is actually something that people are psychologically subject to. It's not like I'm saying that that's in place of confirmation bias. But the goal, the holy grail here, is to evaluate things in a balanced way. And it is easy, especially for those of us who suffer from being a little bit OCD epistemically, to bend the stick so far over the other way that we incapacitate ourselves for seeing the positive evidence. I don't have some perfect psychological drill that you can do to work yourself out of that. It's just a matter of trying hard to reach a point of balance, and maybe we can help one another to that in some respects.
There's one thing I'd actually like to share with that too, because that was a big part of my crisis of belief was, and I think what kept me in that state of crisis for maybe a few months longer than I needed to was this concern about disconfirmation bias. And it wasn't until Lydia called me out on it that I was like, you're totally right. But I think it's something we really need to put at the forefront in these conversations about assessing the truth of Christianity, because of how dear the claim is to all of us, especially if you are in a Christian environment and then assessing potentially having to leave that. I think the stakes are so high, not just theologically, but also relationally, socially, things like that, that it's almost natural for this to come up. And then if you also struggle with anxiety and OCD or something like that, even more so, I think you're way more susceptible to this. And then another thing I want to move into, and we have text in the chat from Josh regarding this that Max, I'd love for you to touch on at the end, but I want to talk about divine hiddenness a little bit. What's the strength of this argument? Like, should we be expecting God to be more visible? Are we misunderstanding how visible he is now? And then Max, it looks like the question specifically for you is, what are some good works for people that are interested in diving into this more? So do you want to maybe start us off with that question?
Yeah, sure. So, okay, so the argument from divine hiddenness is sort of a bit parallel to the argument from evil, and some people even think it's a subset of the problem of evil. The way it goes and has been developed by its most famous proponent, John Schellenberg, is roughly like so. So he argues that we can know just a priori as a conceptual truth that a perfectly loving God would never allow a human being capable of relationship with God to be in a situation in which they lack sufficient evidence to rationally believe in God, unless that person is willfully resisting God. So to put it in a shorter way, a perfectly loving God would never allow there to be any non-resistant non-believers, as he puts it. But, so that's one premise. Then the other premise, I'm slightly simplifying the formulation. The other premise says that, but there are, as a matter of fact, non-resistant non-believers in the world, and so then follows the atheistic conclusion. Now, there's a few things to say about that just off the bat, and one is that it's curious to some people, including me, that Schellenberg has formulated this argument as a deductive argument, when most atheist philosophers now have given up on formulating the problem of evil as a deductive argument, and now will generally formulate it in terms of a ratio of likelihoods. So that's the way that, for example, Paul Draper will formulate it, as saying, he would claim that given naturalism, it's more expectable we'd find the types of suffering we do than given theism. I think it's unfortunate that the hiddenness argument has been formulated in this deductive way. And one way it's unfortunate, and this is something I'm currently working on, is that it causes us to completely ignore the question of how expectable the type of world we live in and the type of evidence it contains, and the perhaps sort of mixed and maybe somewhat ambiguous nature of the evidence, how expectable or probable that is conditional on naturalism. Schellenberg only ever talks about this, what we would expect to find given theism, and he claims that it's not what we would expect to find, but he completely ignores the question of whether we would expect to find this sort of slightly mixed picture evidentially given naturalism. And I think actually there are some good reasons for thinking that naturalism predicts something contrary to what we actually observe. So as to the question of, is it, so the way this literature goes is basically that theists defending theism against divine hiddenness will go one of two ways. One is to say that, well, actually, there are no non-resistant non-believers. And the other is to say that, well, maybe there are non-resistant non-believers, but God would have good reasons for allowing that, and then basically give what is in effect a theodicy. I kind of am inclined to think we can do both, and we can come up with somewhat plausible reasons for thinking that both premises of Schellenberg's argument are false. I mean, I think, so we want to be careful here though as well, because clearly there are different propositions with respect to which some people have insufficient evidence for rational belief. So if we're talking about full-blown Christian theism, well, I think it's just obvious that there are some people in human history who didn't have evidence sufficient to rationally believe in Christianity, because they just never heard about Christianity. But then as to the question of whether that's true of the more minimal claim that there's a creator, yeah, I think, and this would relate to some of the things that Tim and Jonathan have both articulated. I think it's much less clear that there are non-resistant non-believers in some more bare kind of theism. And I think, just the very obvious empirical fact that religious belief has been, ubiquitous throughout human history suggests that human beings do sort of intuit these teleological features of the universe pretty strongly. So yeah, and then, I think that there are various kind of interesting and somewhat plausible theodicies that have been given as to why God might allow it to be the case sometimes that some people don't have as much evidence as they could have. Yeah, so in terms of more resources, what else to read? So I think a friend of mine, a philosopher called Charity Anderson, who's at Baylor, has been doing some interesting work recently on hiddenness, and she is also of the mind that we shouldn't kind of be focusing so much on Schellenberg's deductive formulation of the hiddenness argument, and she thinks we should think of it in a more Bayesian probabilistic way. So if you just Google Charity Anderson Divine Hiddenness, you'll find some of her papers. There's an edited collection, a book, edited book, edited by Eleanor Stump and Adam Green, called Hidden Divinity. So that's maybe about 5 years old now, and that has some interesting essays, quite a number of them responding to Schellenberg. Yeah, I think that's probably a good start. Oh, also, actually, I should say there's a really good recent overview article of the hiddenness literature by a friend of mine called Luke Tieninger, and it's on the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So if you just go to IEP, I think it's IEP.com, but either way, Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and just search Divine Hiddenness, and it's a really good piece that overviews the whole topic.
I think one can also, if given the premise that God is good, which I think we can justify through arguments for Christianity, such as the resurrection and so forth, that a good God exists, then one can reasonably reject the premise that long-term non-resistant non-believers exist. That someone might be a non-resistant non-believer at time t, and it simply be the case that God's not done with them yet, and that either they will become a resistant non-believer or God will give them sufficient evidence for Christianity. And if someone does genuinely die in a state of non-resistant non-belief, then I would consider myself a soft inclusivist, meaning that I think that it's possible that God could have some alternative arrangement worked out for people who do genuinely die in a state of non-resistant non-belief, perhaps giving them another opportunity post-death, or appropriating to them the merit of Christ's death or something like that. So I think that these are plausible options as well. In terms of God in the broad sense, as Max said, I don't think that it's necessarily the case that God, construed in the broad sense, is hidden. I think that Richard Dawkins famously says that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And what he means by that is that prior to Darwin in 1859, it was widely taken for granted that God exists. Tim is an expert on the so-called deist controversy, right, in England, and many of the critics of Christianity were deists rather than atheists back in the day. And so if Darwin got it wrong, as I would contend based on the scientific evidence that he did, then we're actually back to where we were before Darwin, where the existence of a creator is obvious from biological organisms. And even the challenge to naturalism is far more exacerbated now than it was in the days of Darwin in view of our modern advances in the life sciences. So.
Tim, do you have anything you want to jump in with on this, on divine hiddenness?
Oh yeah, I mean, just to follow up on Jonathan's comment, you can find people like Voltaire saying, never been such a fool as to deny that there's a creator of this world. Voltaire was certainly no one who had any gentle feelings toward organized religion, but it's, you can go back to On the Nature of the Gods by Cicero. You can find people who were not at all Christians and not sympathetic to Judaism or to Islam, nevertheless thought that it was just plain as the nose on your face, that of course there's some kind of vastly powerful and intelligent cause of all of this. I'm not saying that there are not objections that can be raised, but if you're going to go and get ultra sophisticated in raising your objections, then you need to allow for more sophisticated rejoinders as well. And so my experience of this has been that the deeper I probe into the most sophisticated attempts to object, the more I see that there are sophisticated answers. And if you aren't pushing into it at that level, I think for every level of inquiry, there is evidence that's right there. So, my initial response when people ask me about this is, well, it's not all that hidden. But for the specific truths of the gospel, the more historically nailed down bits, there, yes. I like what Joseph Butler says in The Analogy of Religion, one of the great works from the early to mid 18th century, which he says our state here is a state of probation. And for some people, a significant part of that probation is their continuing with their whole heart to seek after the right answer and the right resolution to these conundrums that they're faced with. And that may be some people's trial here. That may be what they go through. Other people go through other things. Some of us brainiacs may just have to go through the question, all right, what's the answer to this objection? Where does this evidence point? Is there something more here? Have I missed something? And going through that shouldn't be an endless process, but it may be that this is one of the ways that we find out whether we're those that are being spoken of when we read, if you seek me, you will find me, if you seek me with your whole heart.
And if natural theology renders it non-obvious that there's nothing to the Christian claim, then that should propel one to then go and investigate the evidences for Christianity, given the stakes that are involved. And so that's what I would finish with. I think so people know about Pascal's wager. Well, Butler also had his wager, right? His wager was that if it's non-obvious that there's nothing to the Christian claim, then one better go and investigate, given the stakes that are involved. And so I think that's an important aspect of this as well.
Right. You can find that in Butler. You can also find that in George Berkeley's Alciphron, which is a work I wish more people would go back and read. Berkeley is good for something more than just some version of idealism.
Very cool, you guys. We've had a couple of mentions in the chats, and I know this is also just something that we've all discussed within Talk About Doubts, but I'd love to get your guys' thoughts on some of the emotional factors and obstacles and struggles that people, either Christians doubting their worldview or maybe non-Christians investigating Christianity. What are some things you've seen trip people up? And I know that this is going to be maybe more personalized, like there's not going to be a lot of broad general trends that applies to everyone, but I'd love to just hear kind of what you guys have observed with your time in meeting with doubters.
Maybe you want to comment on this, Justin, since it's some.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair right there. Yeah, I like I touched on earlier, the disconfirmation bias was a huge factor for me that really kept me freaking out about, or really kept me within that crisis. I think another thing was the fallacy of objections that Tim talked about. I think that there's an emotional side to that as well, where there's this emotional reluctance to operate as a Christian while there's a chance that there is a strong objection to Christianity out there. Because you just can't cover all the material in this conversation before you make a decision. There becomes a certain point where it's like, all right, I got to keep living, and I got to decide if I'm going to do that following Jesus or not. And I think that there's a huge emotional hurdle there when it comes to still moving through the Christian life while investigating that. And I think the third thing is just kind of general anxiety and OCD. I have a clinical anxiety and OCD disorder that I'm on medication for, and it definitely played a part in my crisis of belief. I think it still continues to play a role in my just epistemology and how I think about my beliefs. And I think it's more and more common. That's been something that's really surprised me through my involvement with Talk About Doubts, is how many people that are going through these crises of beliefs also have some sort of anxiety or OCD affliction. And I don't think that's purely coincidence. So those are a few of the factors that I would say I've noticed both through my own story and other people's stories. But I'd be interested to hear what you guys have as well.
I find that a lot of people that we talk to are expecting to be able to justify 100% certainty that Christianity is true. And if there's any uncertainty about it, then that is a major factor, is a major deal. And I can certainly relate to that in terms of another struggle that I experience, and that is I have flying anxiety. So I have anxiety about flying, even though rationally I'm persuaded that the airplane engineering is trustworthy. Planes are very, very safe. It's a very, very safe way to travel, and that the pilots are highly qualified, highly experienced, and so forth. Nonetheless, when I'm at 30 or 40,000 feet, it just doesn't feel like that to me, even though I know it rationally. And that's essentially what's happening there, I think, is where you have a stuck prior, where the prior doesn't update based on the evidence. And I have to, I mean, I'm a frequent flyer despite the anxiety about flying. And so I just have to tell myself that even though it doesn't feel safe to me, I'm being irrational in thinking that. And so I live my life on the presumption that it is in fact safe, even though I resist that emotionally.
I've noticed, oh, sorry, Max, go.
No, you go, Tim.
I've noticed an asymmetry, and that I think may have, I'm not sure if emotional is the right way to describe it, maybe a social dimension, which is that when someone who has been raised within Christianity has questions that haven't yet been answered, but hasn't yet decided to take the exit, I find such people are really much more receptive to having the questions answered. Once they've taken that step, maybe broken relationships, moved out of the circle, it's an extremely painful thing to go through, right? At any time that you have to break with a group of people that you've known and interacted with, maybe some of them you've loved, maybe some of them are family, that's tremendously painful. And what I find is that without having acquired any more evidence than they had before they took that step, they're much more resistant to having such questions as can be answered, or to being satisfied by evidence that is less than absolutely certain to, knock this one out of the ballpark. And I think that there's a social dimension to that, right? Now that you've broken those relationships, what would it even mean to say, oh, I was actually not in full possession of all the relevant evidence and being a pure logical agent like any of us ever are. But yeah, that has its own sort of double burden of pain and relational pain that comes with it. It's not hopeless. It's not like there's no way to overcome that. But whenever I have a father write me an email and say, oh, my son just told me that he's walked away from Christianity, my silent thought is just, why couldn't we have had a conversation about that a year ago or 2 years ago? Why are we waiting for it now? It does make it harder. That those conversations are still worth having. That's why we do this at all, right? So I'm not at all saying, well, just give it up at that point. Quite the contrary. But I have noticed that there seems to be this asymmetry that, the distance between where you are and confident belief isn't all that far when you're troubled by doubts. And then once you've decided that it was all wrong, then it seems vast, even if there's no new change in the evidence. So I don't know what more to make of that, but just I thought it would be worth putting out there. Maybe that's sort of in the line of the disconfirmation bias. At that point, it just becomes like, well, yeah, no, I've been through that. But I see people who think they figured it all out when they were 14. And I just wonder, how far did you dig into this at that time? Because that's an awful lot to hang a lifetime of, no, I don't even need to look through your lousy telescope, Galileo, on, I figured this out when I was 14. Not everybody's like that. I don't mean to make a one-size-fits-all description there, but I have noticed the asymmetry. I thought it would be worth mentioning here.
Yeah, I think those are all really helpful thoughts. And Yeah, Justin, I think your framing of it was right. I mean, it's obviously a very personal topic, and it is sort of bound up with mental health, and certainly I can relate to the OCD type experience of doubt. So I suppose about, gosh, maybe 4 years ago now, I really had some kind of difficult few months where I think and this is also partly due to sort of shifting my views on epistemology. So I had been quite fond of reformed epistemology, and I think I mean, this is a bit of an aside, but I think the others on the panel will probably very much share this view, that I do think, unfortunately, reformed epistemology, the idea that, you know, you can have rationally justified beliefs without needing any arguments, which has been defended most notably by Alvin Plantinga and is quite popular in some circles. I do think, unfortunately, it leaves people quite vulnerable to doubt when they encounter, you know, evidential arguments against theism. You know, Plantinga's response is basically to encourage people to tough it out and just dig deeper into their religious experiences, which unfortunately for some people just doesn't do the trick. So yeah, I'm just going back to the OCD thing though. One thing I have grappled with is the fact that I think, like Justin articulated this quite well, or maybe it was Jonathan, that there is this trait in some people, I imagine it might be true of a lot of people on this call, that it's very hard to emotionally be sort of reconciled to the fact that you can't rule out all possibilities of being in error, even if you think that those error possibilities occupy a very tiny portion of the probability space. And that can somehow just feel very emotionally painful. And so, for example, I've had experiences of just cycling along on my bike, and suddenly a sort of naturalistic hypothesis for the resurrection will occur to me. You know, it might be a really far-fetched one. One time I think I was thinking about, well, what if some kind of simulation hypothesis is true, like the sort that Nick Bostrom defends, and the designers of the simulation are just trying to mess with us by giving us evidence that sort of seems to point to the truth of Christianity, but actually it's all just a sort of big game. And I couldn't get this out of my head for the rest of the day, and it really bothered me, even though I didn't remotely think that it was more than like a tiny fraction of a percent probable. So that there is that there is a sort of mental health dimension to this, I think, and I did actually end up looking a bit into some of the literature around OCD, and one thing that they will say about it is that it's sort of to do with desensitizing yourself to risk, to epistemic risk. So in the same way that, when people have hand washing type OCDs, where they're very, very over meticulous about not wanting to catch germs or anything, the way you help someone out of that is not to, give them the best sort of anti-bac hand wash in the world. It's actually to give them more exposure to situations that will increase their tolerance of risk. And so I think that you can carry some lessons over to the situation of doubt and epistemic OCD. So I think you basically, I mean, if you're an evidentialist, and you're basically committed to thinking that and if you're an evidentialist and you also think that the best types of argument for Christianity are probabilistic, as I do, then you have to be reconciled to the fact that there is some small probability that you assign to Christianity being false, and it's about how you kind of learn to live with that. And I think one way that I tried to come to terms with that was actually to think through, well, look, I think that naturalism is extremely improbable, but let's just suppose naturalism turned out to be true. What exactly am I afraid of? And then, you know, when I started to think it through, I realized, well, yeah, no, actually, I'm not particularly afraid of the idea of being annihilated, you know, which is presumably what would happen if naturalism were true. So I think, you know, in a sense, kind of bottoming out your fears, and what is it that you're afraid of when you've got this 0.001 probability that you assign to the truth of naturalism, let's say. And I think it can be helpful to sort of work through that and try and figure out what is it that's causing you to be afraid. And I think once you sort of face that, it can be that you sort of become more tolerant to that epistemic risk and are able to not be kind of haunted by these sort of crazy alternate hypotheses for the resurrection, like the ones that I used to fixate on.
I suppose just for light relief, I should admit that when I was 4 or 5 years old, I was the Calvin afraid of monsters under the bed kid. And I'm sorry to say that what got me out of that phase was not a chain of rational argumentation, but something else. So that to the extent that that itself was a manifestation of terror over what I understood rationally were bare possibilities, unsubstantiated by anything except the occasional nightmare, which was probably brought on by my anxiety. I understand that it can be the sort of thing that can bedevil you, and you can know the arguments, as Jonathan was saying about air travel, and yet you still have a panic attack or something that feels like one coming on when you're confronted with something that you don't actually think is a live option in terms of the kind of thing that you really ought to need to sit down and take into account as you're tallying up risks. But there's going to be some ineliminable possibility of being wrong about very nearly anything that you care much about, unless you really care a whole lot about 1 = 1 or some similar mathematical claim. But that's life, and that's okay. A lot of people, though, are not in the position of saying, I'm anxious about something that is just a bare possibility. They're anxious about something because maybe things seem foggy. It doesn't look right now like there's any clear direction that the evidence points. I get that. I understand that. And all that I would say is pursue the questions with an amount of seriousness and effort commensurate to both the antecedent probability that you're wrong in your current estimate and the relevance of these things to your life if it should turn out that it's true after all.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Max.
I'll just be really quick. I was just going to say the other thing I found helpful is to not think that you're going through it alone. And what can be very helpful is just finding community. Find even just a couple of other people. You know, sometimes people get into prayer triplets or have accountability partners. You know, find some doubt accountability partners, if you like, so that it somehow just feels like you're not any longer kind of on your own having to fight all of these, you know, these demons, these possibilities of Christianity not being true. You can actually treat this as a kind of shared journey, and somehow, at least in my case, that just really changed the feel of it and didn't make it this kind of terrifying thing anymore. Because I also think, you know, here's one thing about doubt that can really terrify people when they feel they can't talk about it with their Christian friends and their Christian community, because, you know, they feel like they might destabilize other people, or that you even might that there's a fear of being a fraud or something like that, you know. And actually, I think there's significant power, and you can break that fear just by sort of having other people, ideally people who are, you know, inquisitive and able to engage seriously in the sorts of evidences that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and come along to our emotional support groups on Thursday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern, led by Justin. And yeah, it's a great opportunity.
That's one thing I'd love to kind of round out this question with that I was thinking about while y'all were talking is I think I would say a good number of modern churches in the West, the climate that they create when it comes to asking questions, or rather the lack thereof, is what sets up this false dichotomy between being intellectually honest and being a Christian. I think there's a lot of people that end up abandoning their Christian faith because their only exposure to Christianity, their Christian environment, is a Christianity that doesn't allow questions, that doesn't allow doubts. I know that's how it was for me. Like I was really involved in a campus ministry. And then when I started asking my questions and stuff, like I lost a lot of relationships. I wasn't able to participate in some of the same leadership positions that I'd been in before. And I don't think that's an uncommon story. And I think that's a huge factor that is an emotional obstacle for people, is that their social environment and what they've been exposed to as Christianity doesn't allow questions. I do want to, I see some great questions. Oh wait, I see. At what level do you think that doubt about God should exclude you from being involved in leading Christian ministry? Is that what you're referring to, Tim, in your question? Yeah, so let me touch on that. As someone who had to step down from a leadership position in an on-campus ministry because of my doubts, I want to say that for your sake and for the sake of the people that are under you in whatever capacity it is, I think you should be well studied in what you're teaching. So for me, I had a similar experience where I was asking a lot of doctrinal questions, and the curriculum that my campus ministry wanted me to teach through, it made a lot of statements, a lot of claims that I didn't know was true yet, or that I hadn't studied yet, and I couldn't honestly say like, hey, this is the true doctrine. And that's what ultimately led to me having to step down. But I do think there's an issue here, and it comes back to that kind of church climate in the West where questioning is so out of the realm of church activity that we almost instinctively are like, oh, we can't have someone asking questions and in a leadership position. But I think some of the best people to have as leaders are the ones asking questions, are the ones willing to evaluate their positions continuously and things like that. So I don't have like a clear black and white answer on when someone should step out of ministry and when not. And I'd be happy to get on a call with you, Daniel, and talk about that a little bit more. But yeah, I would definitely say that there's some cultural issues there, and then there's also some things where you gotta think about what you're doing for yourself as well as for the people that you're teaching. I want to be conscientious of our panelists' time, and I want to move into resurrection and the New Testament topics, just to get everyone on the same page for kind of the cumulative maximal data approach that we really share here at Talk About Doubts. Jonathan, I want to ask as quick as possible, can you lay out an overview for this? I've seen you do it pretty quick, but I want to see if you can beat your record.
Okay, let me try. So let me contrast the minimal facts approach with the maximal data that I think everyone on this panel would subscribe to. And the maximal, so the minimal facts case first is basically what was put forward by Gary Habermas in a number of his books, also by Michael Licona. He calls it the bedrock facts. And basically the criteria in order to qualify as a minimal fact, a fact has to not only in Habermas's assessment be well supported by the historical evidence, but also it has to enjoy more than the support from more than 90% of scholars across the theological spectrum. And so the appearances, for example, is one of the facts that Habermas would appeal to. And there's a number of concerns that we have concerning the minimal facts approach. One of those would be that when Habermas or Licona are pressed on some sort of objective vision hypothesis or mass hallucinatory hypothesis, a common rejoinder would be to point out the implausibility of shared or group hallucinations, or perhaps multisensory type visions. But the problem with that is that the shared or experiences are no longer a minimal fact by the criteria, because the shared experiences of the risen Jesus are not agreed upon by more than 90% of scholars across the theological spectrum. And so Habermas has to change his criteria midway through the argument without telling his audience. And so I find that to be problematic. I'm also not convinced that you can fully justify belief in the resurrection on the basis solely of the Pauline corpus. So Habermas and Lacuna like to emphasize the Pauline corpus, especially 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, which is this pre-Pauline oral tradition that Paul appears to pass on to the Corinthians. And one concern that we have is that if we're unable to say what the resurrection experiences were like, what was their nature, it becomes very difficult to evaluate the rationality of the apostles' belief that Jesus, in fact, was raised from the dead. And so I would argue, and those of us on this panel would argue, that you really have to appeal to the Gospels and Acts in order to fully justify belief in the resurrection, because it's in the Gospels and Acts that we have the multisensory or polymodal character of the resurrection experiences. They involve not just individual sightings at a great distance and very briefly, but rather in group appearances, group conversations with Jesus, physical contact, long discourses, eating food with on more than one occasion. Luke 24, he eats broiled fish in their presence. In John 21, they eat breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. According to Acts 1, it's extended across a 40-day time period. So it's not merely a brief and confusing episode. And so that's the sort of set of testimonial claims about which it's difficult to be honestly mistaken. The other hypothesis competing with the resurrection would be the idea that the apostles lied deliberately about whether Jesus was raised from the dead. But when we examine the circumstances into which Christianity was birthed, we discover there's a context of persecution whereby the early apostles were willing to voluntarily undergo and endure sufferings and labors and dangers and hardships and persecutions, in some cases martyrdom, on account of their testimony that Christ was raised from the dead. And that goes a long way towards establishing they were at least sincere. And so if it's immensely implausible that they were honestly mistaken and immensely implausible that they were lying, then the best explanation is that Jesus, in fact, rose from the dead. So the crucial aspect of that case then would be whether the Gospels and Acts claims concerning the resurrection actually reflect the unembellished testimony of those who were purportedly eyewitnesses, and that would be a point that we would argue for at length. So is that a fair summary, Justin?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to lay it out, and I think that helps address the minimal facts question as well that we have in the chat. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on comparing the evidence for the resurrection to some other miracle claims, such as the appearances to Joseph Smith or Muhammad or something like that, that a lot of us are going to be encountering. What sets the resurrection claims apart in the strongest sense?
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to say that I think the key thing to keep your eye on is the question of whether there is what I'll call an epistemic bottleneck. That is to say, whether at some point all of this is being routed through one person. So, we have an affidavit signed by 11 people, yes, but it was all drafted by one guy, and all the signatories were members either of Smith's family or of the Whitmer family. And so we don't have actually the testimony, the words of any of those people, just that they signed something that they were presented with by someone who had written it up. So this is it. The evidence begins to look a lot worse the moment you scratch the surface on these things, whether because it was collected at a great distance in time and refers to private experiences that were not of things done in public, or because it is all routed through one person who had a dominant personality and certainly a dominating control over the members of his own family and those of other families in their little group that was trying to run away to parts less thickly strewn with the skeptical, let's say.
And with Mormonism, I mean, everything appears. I mean, at least with the Bible, even if you don't grant the supernatural aspects of the biblical text, at least it's set in the real world. the Book of Mormon is set essentially in fantasy lands where we can't really identify any of the places or events or people groups, the Nephites and the Lamanites. We have no evidence that they existed. Everything that we can cross-check in the Book of Mormon turns out to be false. It's even allegedly translated from a language, Reformed Egyptian, that we have no archaeological evidence ever existed. So it's very, very shaky. Nothing like what we have for Christianity. Tim, do you also want to mention the John Douglas's criteria, because this is relevant here to compare?
Right. So one of the many responses to Hume is a book by John Douglas called The Criterion. Douglas lays out criteria for assessing miracle claims, not for saying these are definitely false, but for saying if you don't pass these filters, then there is a reason to doubt here. And three that he puts up front are when the first report of the alleged miracle comes a great distance in time from the time at which the events allegedly transpired, when the first report is issued at a great distance in space from the location where these things allegedly happened, and when the report is something that might have been allowed to pass without examination, perhaps because it fell in with the religious predilections of the people among whom it first circulated. And any of these, Douglas says, provides us with a reason to doubt. So one of the challenges that sometimes cast up against Christians is, well, there are a lot of miracle reports in a lot of different traditions. Why should we start with yours? If we're going to start looking into these, why should we start there? And the fact is that the miracle reports in other religious traditions generally are either easily disproved, right? You see videotape of Sathya Sai Baba doing a little sleight of hand thing and producing a trinket for the adoring followers, or they are matters that failed to pass through one or more of Douglas's filters. And yes, if there's an easy, natural explanation, as Joshua is saying, that is itself something. William Paley discusses all of this kind of stuff because he had read Douglas's work in his view of the evidences of Christianity in part 2, but we don't all that often actually go back and read Paley. We just remember that he said something about a watch and then we forget all the rest of it. But I want to make Paley great again. I want people to come back and actually read some more of his evidences. If I could make every minister of the gospel study a tenth of what Paley had written, we'd have another awakening. It would be amazing.
I love that, you guys. I love it. I would love to, just because it came up in what you're talking about. Tim, I'd love to get your thoughts specifically on Hume's objection to justified belief in miracles. Like, isn't everything we're talking about kind of pointless because Hume was right anyways? That's what I've heard you say before, at least.
Yeah, so when my oldest daughter, Bethel, made a list of things she learned from her parents, I think the first things were be like, make your bed, be polite to people, and then it started in with Hume was wrong, Hume was wrong, Hume was wrong. Those were three of the top 10 lessons she learned. Hume's critique of reported miracles has been very influential, but the further you look into it, the more it just pops like a soap bubble. He tries to set up an arm wrestling contest between our evidence for the laws of nature and our evidence for allegedly miraculous events. But this is just the wrong way to put it. Hume is sort of foisting a false dilemma upon us. The laws of nature are the ways that nature behaves when it is left to itself. But a miracle is precisely an occasion when it is not left to itself. And so, of course, we should not be setting up an opposition between those. The laws of nature tell you what you can expect when nature is left to itself. They do not tell you how strongly you should expect it to be left to itself, particularly in specific circumstances. Now, nobody wants to be a chump, right? Nobody wants to just say, oh, I'll believe any miracle claim you give me. I've known people like that. And I feel just sad when I hear them say that, like, no, that was not the message. You were not supposed to go that way. But if we are looking for the evidence that there's been some kind of incursion of omnipotence into a world that normally runs along lines where natural causes precede natural effects, then we want evidence. But I mean, how else could God signal his presence than by the act of sovereignty, by making something happen that would not have happened had God not acted? That's kind of the only way to do it. So I think Hume actually gets it completely wrong. Anyway, I have talks and articles and books, and you can read my SEP article on miracles and all this. I'm not going to bore people with more of that, but yeah.
One point I'll add, of course, is that if I mean, what's the claim of the New Testament and the Old Testament is that God has wrought miracles as authenticating signs to vindicate the credentials of a divine messenger, whether that be an apostle or a prophet or Jesus himself. And if that hypothesis is true, then it would very strongly predict that miracles would deviate from the normal course of nature, the way nature normally behaves when left to itself. Because if it didn't, then miracles would be robbed of their evidential value in authenticating a divine messenger. And so the fact that they do, in fact, deviate from the normal course of nature can't be used as a serious argument against the hypothesis that God has wrought miracles as authenticating signs in history. You have to look at other considerations to elucidate the intrinsic or prior probability of God performing a miracle in Jesus' case specifically.
Very cool, you guys. One question that we're getting in the chat, and I want to kind of connect it to a bigger question, is something we'll frequently see come up from both Christians, doubting, and skeptics, is that they would simply believe in Christianity if they had some sort of divine personal religious experience, whether that was an audible voice or a vision or something like that. And I think, to be fair to the people that hold to this, that there is an issue within the church where this has been normalized in a sense, in various degrees of Christian life, where there's almost this expectation of that kind of audible or visual, or maybe the leading of the Holy Spirit, as some may call it, that sort of interaction with God. And I'd love to get your guys' thoughts as interacting with doubters and helping people think through these worldviews of what is the issue of hoping for some sort of audible or visionary experience and then kind of putting all your chips on that.
I'm going to just jump right in here where angels fear to tread. This is something that has been around for a long time. And what you want to do is go get the book, The Eclipse of Faith by Henry Rogers. I've given you an edition in the chat that you can look up, because he has an entire section called The Paradise of Fools exactly on this question. And basically, he shows that you can try this way or that way. We could have some unbreakable monument in which all this stuff was inscribed. We could have specific visions appearing to each person, and people would find some way around it. And he's very artful, and it makes amusing reading in that way. So he is actually riffing on something that comes from a book by John Howe. Let me see if I can put that in too. This is a Puritan writer. So in the works of John Howe, there's a reprint of that, and Howe does something similar, and then Rogers picks it up and buffs it up for a 19th century audience. But if you want to see somebody actually grappling with this, look at Howe and or at Rogers. So just because I know that these actual answers exist, because the question's been around for that long, you just need to go back and dig into this. So as late as the before 1700, Howe was having people say that, and he engages with it. It's an old objection.
One point I'll make on that particular point is that if it would be sufficient for you to have such a veridical experience, then testimony in principle ought to be sufficient justification for belief in God. So there could be in principle testimony from others who have had a veridical experience, and testimony, of course, is a form of evidence, and depending on the nature of those claims, it could even be in principle sufficient evidence. So Craig Keener, for example, has a 2-volume set on contemporary miracles, not all of which are equally well documented or attested, but there's enough there that seem to be well attested, have medical professionals vouching for them, have even in some cases medical records, and testimony to the before and after condition, and the unlikelihood that some of these conditions could come about just by coincidence or would have happened anyway, and even in many of those cases happening in the context of prayer, that I think is evidence that favors the hypothesis that God still is in fact at work in the world today. And we know in scripture that God works in different ways in different people's experiences. So it should be particularly surprising that he does the same today. And people often raise the objection when I bring this up that, well, you look at the hits and you ignore the misses. There's lots of people that pray for healing and they don't get healed. And that's certainly true. But I think that there's an epistemic asymmetry here, where the cases where people do pray for healing and they are healed in very providential and even miraculous ways, that is much stronger evidence confirming special divine action than non-answers to prayer are in disconfirming it, because it's far more surprising on naturalism that such cases would exist than the counter cases are surprising on Christianity. So hopefully that makes sense.
There's one thing I'd love to chime in on that too, Jonathan, to take your thinking a step further. Is a flaw that I see in some skeptical thinking is the same people who will appeal to some sort of mass hallucination to explain the testimony of the gospel authors would be comfortable accepting an individual personal religious experience. And I think it really illuminates kind of the point you're making. It's okay, if we have 5 testimonials, or if we have 4 or 5 or whatever number of testimonials of a miraculous or religious experience, that should, all of the things equal, trump the one like individual religious experience. So I think that's an interesting slight that we see kind of in the modern conversation of the same people being a struggle to accept testimony instead of that personal experience. And then another question that we're getting in the chat, and this one's a loaded one, so maybe it'll be more referring to some other resources. But Brent has a question kind of just generally regarding free will and how that plays into evaluating the Christian worldview versus naturalism and things like that. Brent, I'm not going to try and sum up your question entirely. I think Tim and the other panelists have gotten a glance at it in the chat. But I'd love to just hear any thoughts that the panelists have regarding what role does free will play when thinking through likelihood of naturalism versus Christianity or things like that. And again, loaded question, maybe refer to some other things that people can do some more learning on.
Max, do you want to start with this one since you have to leave in just a few minutes here?
Yeah. So, okay. One thing I'll say is that although I am a libertarian about free will, I think sometimes people overestimate how crucial that is to the Christian, to the defense of Christian theism. I mean, when you consider, at least historically, that many significant figures in the Christian theological tradition were compatibilists, which is to say they thought that freedom of a kind that's robust enough to underpin moral accountability is compatible with some sort of determinism. I think that's a clue that the type of libertarian free will that many Christian philosophers defend today may not be as crucial to the defense of Christianity as we might think. As I said, though, I do incline towards libertarianism about free will. So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. The idea that free will is an illusion, I guess I'm not totally clear what the objection is there, other than, is that just a rhetorical way of stating or asserting that libertarianism is false? So, I mean, basically, you've sort of got 2 major kinds of arguments against libertarianism in the free will literature. So one of them is an argument that, well, is basically an argument for determinism, which, of course, if determinism is true, then libertarian free will can't be the case. And so, yeah, I partly whether we have free will of that kind, of the libertarian kind, turns on whether the universe it genuinely is physically indeterministic. I would say, at least from a scientific point of view, it seems it's very much open at this point to think that it's certainly an epistemic possibility, if not epistemically probable, that there is some kind of genuine physical indeterminism in the universe, which would be a necessary precondition for libertarian free will. Yeah, and then the other objection is a kind of claim that libertarian free will somehow doesn't make sense, that it's incoherent. I'm not sure how much to get into the details of that, but I'm not sure. Who was it that asked the question? I wasn't totally sure what angle the question was coming from. Or was that a question you had sent in already, Justin? Or
yeah, this was a question that we got in the chat during the discussion.
Okay.
I would agree with Max that we have free will. I think that the person that denies that we have free will has to shoulder a really substantial burden of proof, because we strongly have the appearance, it strongly appears to us that we have free will. And so one is justified by direct acquaintance, I think, that we have free will, and if someone wants to reject that notion, then they meant to be prepared to bring it. But until then, I think that we are justified fully in believing that free will exists.
Can I just push this in the direction of Mackenzie's comment regarding the question of choosing salvation? To believe that one has the ability to do otherwise, which is one of the most common definitions of libertarian free will, is not to maintain that I can look around my current surroundings in my room, where I can see all of the walls and all of the furniture. It's not a very large room, and somehow by an effort make myself believe that there is a Siberian tiger in the room. That's not what libertarian free will is, nor is it the view that I can look around at at a universe from which all evidence of God seems to have been withdrawn, and that just make myself believe in God, like making myself believe in Santa Claus. But what I can do is choose whether to follow up or not follow up some line of evidence, pick up and read or leave on the shelf some book that I know makes a case for something which might be important if I were to acquiesce in the case. I can refuse to track things down, or I can pursue these things. And so that's a rather straightforward way in which our ability to choose has an effect on what we believe. Not because I can gin up belief by an effort of will, but because I have the ability to turn my back on paths of evidence that I have reason to believe would be promising. And in turning my back on them, I do something that entangles me in the ethics of belief formation. It's not a matter of willing myself into or out of theistic belief or Christian belief, but it's a matter of seeking with my whole heart what is true on the issue. And again, if I have enough evidence that it's not clear that there's nothing to it, then that's going to impose obligations on me and the way that I pursue that evidence. So I want to just make that distinction, that believing in the freedom of the will is not believing that I can just will myself into believing anything willy-nilly, but it may affect the way I pursue my inquiry.
Thank you guys very much. Max, you got to get going.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. It's been great to be with you.
Thank you, Max.
Yeah, thank you so much, Max.
I'm going to have to pull out at this point too, Justin. So thank you guys. And this is great. Let's do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Totally.
All right, folks.
Take care.
Bye, Tim.
Bye.
Jonathan, question for you from Caleb.
Okay.
Do you think something like Dale Allison's skeptical scenario, although more complex than the resurrection hypothesis, has a higher prior? I don't know if you're familiar with that or not.
I've read a lot of Dale Allison's book. Which particular point in the book is he referring to?
Caleb, you're welcome to unmute and clarify, or you can send something in the chat.
Not like, it doesn't need to be a specific scenario, but any kind of juxtaposition of different, like you have a different hypothesis for the empty tomb, and then bereavement hallucinations, and then communal reinforcement, and then stuff like that, would that have a higher prior probability than the resurrection?
I think it would be, I think that sort of approach would be more efficacious in rebutting a minimal facts case for the resurrection. I think it's going to be far more difficult to account for the data for a kind of a maximal data approach that I would take. I think it's very difficult to suppose that the apostles were honestly mistaken if indeed we grant that the Gospels and Acts do reflect the unembellished testimony of those who were purported eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection. That would, of course, be a point that Dale Allison would deny. So, I mean, when you have to scotch tape together a lot of auxiliary hypotheses to make the different aspects of the data work, then I would much prefer to go with a simpler explanation, which makes sense of all of the data, which is that, in fact, Jesus rose from the dead. In terms of prior probability, I think that I do think the prior probability or the intrinsic plausibility of God performing a miracle in Jesus' case, such as the resurrection, I don't think it's particularly low. I certainly don't think it's astronomically small. And I think there are a number of background considerations that bear on the plausibility of God performing a miracle in Jesus' case. So, for example, I would appeal there to the argument from messianic predictive prophecy, and to the trilemma argument and the argument from the conversion of the Apostle Paul, that provide background considerations that give us already reason to think, independently of the resurrection, that God may well have motivation for raising Jesus of Nazareth specifically from the dead, especially in view of Isaiah 53:10, which seems to indicate that the Messiah would be raised from the dead. And of course, Jesus himself made predictions concerning his resurrection as the ultimate vindication of his messianic and divine self-claims. And so, I mean, to summarize a few of those arguments briefly, so in terms of the argument for messianic prophecy, one example of messianic prophecy, which seems to me to be quite incontestable, is Isaiah 49:6 and Isaiah 42:6 say that the Messiah was supposed to be a light to the Gentiles, that God's salvation would reach the ends of the earth. Now, this, in spite of the fact that in Isaiah 53 verses 1 and 2, we learn that the Jews, the Messiah is supposed to be rejected by his own people, the Jews. Now, that itself is not particularly surprising because most prophets were at some point, but what is surprising is that someone that is rejected by his own people, the Jews, would nonetheless bring representatives of all nations to recognize the God of Israel. Now, who has done that except the person of Christ? And then there's other arguments like Jesus' birth in Bethlehem fulfills Micah 5:2. We could talk about the historiographical evidence Jesus really was born in Bethlehem, and for the reliability of the nativity accounts concerning Jesus. There's also the fact that Jesus' death coincides with the Jewish feast of Passover in Nisan 15, which fulfills the feast of Passover. It fulfills symbolic imagery relating to that, and so forth. And so you can build a cumulative argument for messianic prophecy in that way. There's also the trilemma argument, which says that there's very compelling evidence that Jesus claimed divine status, that he asserted himself to be the God of Israel incarnate. And if that's the case, as I would contend it is, then one of two things is true. Either Jesus was who he said he was, or he wasn't. And if he wasn't, either he knew he wasn't or he didn't. And the fact that Jesus was willing to get himself crucified on account of that testimonial claim goes a long way towards establishing that he was at least sincere in making that statement. And there seems to be a very small reference class of individuals that could be honestly mistaken about being the creator of the universe and the God of Israel incarnate. And so that, again, even if it doesn't secure the conclusion that Jesus is who he said he was, it does tend to move the needle in that direction. And then another argument would be the conversion of the Apostle Paul. I've argued at length that Acts 9 actually reflects the testimony of the Apostle Paul himself. And if that's the case, then when we inspect the multi-sensory nature of it, includes not just a visual component, but also an auditory component. There's it's intersensory in the sense that his companions he's traveling with also have some sort of sensory experience. He's blinded as a result of the experience. He's healed by Ananias later, and so forth. That's the sort of thing about which it's stretching it a little to say that he was honestly mistaken. Paul also seems to perform miracles that he writes about in 2 Corinthians 12 and Romans 15 that the church in Corinth were familiar with. He mentions that the signs of an apostle were performed in your midst. And so that bolsters that argument further. And Paul, of course, we know was persecuted tremendously for his faith. You read his laundry list, 2 Corinthians 11, for example, or in the book of Acts, or in Clement of Rome, or in other part of Philippians and the pastoral letters. And so it seems implausible that Paul was making stuff up for self-gain. It goes a long way towards establishing that Paul was at least sincere. And so again, it tends to move the needle in the direction of Christianity. And then, of course, there's the argument for contemporary miracles and the survival of the nation of Israel against all odds, and so forth. And each of these arguments moves the needle in the direction of Christianity, and therefore provides background information or background considerations which bear positively on the intrinsic plausibility or the prior probability of Jesus' resurrection. So does that answer your question, Caleb?
I think roughly, yeah. For the priors, is that some of the stuff that Swinburne talks about in his book?
Swinburne has an alternative approach to assessing priors of the resurrection. I think that my approach is stronger personally, and Tim also takes a similar approach to myself and would agree that our approach that we take is stronger than that offered by Swinburne.
Okay.
I want to do one last call for questions. We have one more question planned out right now, but if you have any last questions you'd like to get in for Jonathan, feel free to drop those in the chat or raise your hand or drop them in the Discord. Jonathan, the final question I have for you is, if you're interacting with someone that appealed to the Gospels or maybe just the New Testament more broadly having legendary embellishment within, that they claim the whole thing is just kind of legendary embellishment over time, what would be the strongest pieces of evidence that you would bring up to counteract that?
Yeah, so I would appeal to both internal and external lines of evidence to support the robust reliability of the Gospels and Acts. We've been discussing some of this in our teaching course sessions that we've been doing. We've done 7 weeks of that so far. They're on every other Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, if anyone wants to tune in for those and catch the lecture and the live Q&A after. But in summary, let me just give you a few examples. So one line of evidence is the argument from undesigned coincidences, which is basically where you have parallel accounts that intersect and interlock in a way that's surprising if the story is being made up or fictionalized, or if one account is copying from the other, or both are drawing upon a common source. And one of the sources being mentioned in passing, a detail that explains or illuminates a natural question raised by the other. So the two accounts fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. So an example of that would be in Mark's account in chapter 6 and verse 31, we read that the motivation that Jesus and the disciples have for going to a deserted area to eat is because there is very, very busy. There are coming and going crowds. They can't find leisure to eat. So they go away to a deserted area by themselves. And then unfortunately for them, the crowds follow. And then we learn in verse 39 that Jesus has the crowds sit down on the green grass. Now, the grass in Israel is actually not green. It's brown throughout the majority of the year, except at a very narrow window of time, a relatively narrow window of time around the spring, because of the higher levels of rainfall that coincides with the Jewish feast of Passover. And so if you go over to John's account in John chapter 6 in verse 4, John doesn't mention the coming and going crowds. He also doesn't mention the green grass, but he does mention in verse 4 that the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. And so then that illuminates why it's so busy, because there's all these pilgrims coming in for the feast of Passover, and also illuminates why the grass is green in a very casual and artless and undesigned way that suggests that these are indeed anchored in historical memory. Then if you go over to the next verse in John 6, and in verse 5, we learn that Jesus turns to Philip to ask him, where do we send the people to buy bread? And this raises an interesting question in the mind of the audience. Why does Jesus turn to Philip here in this particular circumstance? Why not say Judas Iscariot to turn the money back? Philip's a fairly minor character. Why Philip? Well, if you go over 6 chapters later to John 12, verses 21 and 22, completely different Passover feast, different context, unrelated, 6 chapters removed, we learned that there were certain Greeks at the feast of Passover who wanted to speak to Jesus, and they came to Philip, and it just adds in parenthesis, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and they asked him, sir, we wish to see Jesus. Now, Philip, we learned then, is from Bethsaida. Now you go over to Luke's account, Luke chapter 9, verse 10. Luke doesn't mention Philip in this context at all, but he does mention in verse 10 that Bethsaida was the setting of the feeding of the 5,000, which then illuminates what's going on in John 6:5. Jesus turns to Philip to ask where to send the people to buy bread, because Philip's a local guy who knows where the shops are to buy bread. But that's never spelled out explicitly for the reader. One has to do the detective work of putting these pieces together, drawing information from John 6, from John 12, and from Luke 9, and so forth. There's also extra biblical confirmations. So an example in the book of Acts, for example, is that, so in Acts 27, you have Paul in his shipwreck. And so the Alexandrian grain ship that he's on are traversing along the coast of Crete, and it says that a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. And there is actually a well-confirmed wind called the northeaster that strikes at this exact time, around the time of Passover. And the Isle of Cauda to which they're blown is actually precisely the trajectory that the northeaster ought to have carried them. And it's not the sort of information that one could have inferred without having been blown there. The ancients found it nearly impossible to physically locate islands that were that far out off coast, or give a approximation as to their location. And in fact, Ptolemy in the Encyclopedist Pliny the Elder had the estimates in Luke's day, and both differ from Luke as to where the Isle of Cauda was, but Luke's account alone gets the implied location of the Isle of Cauda correct. And so that suggests that the author really was a traveling companion with Paul, that he really was present in that voyage, as he purports to be, with the we passages that we see associated with that text, and other passages throughout the book of Acts, Acts 16 following. So there's just a few examples. There's a lot more that one could dive into. If anyone wants more detail, I recommend Lydia McGrew's book, Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. I recommend William Paley's book, A View of the Evidence of Christianity, as well as his Hora Paulinae, which is a Latin title, though the book's in English. The Latin title means The Times of Paul. I also recommend Colin Hemer's book, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History, as well as James Smith's book, The Guardianship of St. Paul. There's a lot of really great resources. So Lydia's other books, The Mirror of the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices, The Eye of the Beholder, The Gospel of John's Historical Reportage are also excellent resources on this topic. Peter J. Williams' book as well, Can We Trust the Gospels? Also Titus Kennedy's book, which is Excavating the Evidence of Jesus. Also, he's a field archaeologist. He's also on our Talk About Doubts team as well. Excellent resource. So there's just a few resources on that. Hey, you can also check out the first 7 sessions of the online course that I've been doing on Evidences for Christianity, which covers a lot of this material in a lot more depth as well. So I'd refer you to those resources for more.
Awesome. Well, that is all the questions we have, both planned out and in the chat. Jonathan, thank you so much for setting this up. Just for everyone live and for everyone watching on the YouTube recording, I just want to give a quick reminder of the resources we have at Talk About Doubts. We have the one-on-one calls we can do to address any specific questions that you have. We have the emotional support group, which meets Tuesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern, or every other Tuesday at 9 p.m. Eastern. That alternates with the teaching course led by Jonathan. That's also Thursdays, 9 p.m. Eastern. Sorry, both of those are Thursdays. Thank you guys all for joining us. Thank you for participating in everything. Jonathan, any closing words for you?
Yeah, just thanks all for participating, and we'll see you in the Discord channel, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you on Thursday night.
Great. Thank you guys. You guys have a great day.